Next, Zephyr Teachout and Janine Wedel discuss the problem of corruption in American government and business. It's about an hour 20.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event. Thank you so much for coming despite the nor'easter storm and terrible conditions. We really appreciated it. And we could not have a more interesting topic or a better panel to address it. There are some people who are attracted to sort of neat, tiny little problems they'd like to solve, and other types of people who are attracted to chronic problems that are as old as deep as politics itself, and curbing corruption is one of those challenges. And what I want to say about the members of the panel, two of them I know very well, and one which I had the pleasure of meeting just now, is that they are people who manage to talk about this topic, which can be quite distressing, in an uplifting way, and sometimes can make you almost feel optimistic about corruption, if that's possible. So I'm very honored to introduce our panelists. First, Zephyr Teachout, who recently ran for governor of New York in the Democratic primary. I should know, because I was her running mate. And as the author of many books, including Corruption America, which is the book she's talking about today, and has also authored a number of articles about corruption, is professor at Fordham Law School. To her left is Janine Wedel, I hope I said that right,
yes.
Who is an anthropologist at the Policy School at George Mason University. She's the author of the book Unaccountable, which is right here and also back there, and also the author of Shadow Elite and numerous other books. And finally, our moderator today is Larry Lessig, who hardly needs introduction, the founder of the Mayday PAC, founder of Creative Commons, my mentor in law school, my close friend, and all-around person who is changing the world, Larry Lessig. So Larry is the moderator, and I'll let him take it from here.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much, the two of you, for participating in this incredible event, and thank you to the New America, is this New America New York City? Do I have to say it like that, or can I just say New America? For hosting this, which is incredibly timely, and for me, incredibly exciting, because these two books, I had known Zephyr's, I had seen Zephyr's grow for, what, 27 years, but, and I've loved Zephyr's book ever since I first saw its initial iteration. But Janine's book I've just had a chance to read, and these are two extraordinary books that perfectly complement each other. And they complement each other in the context of a moment where, as a culture, we have fixed on an incredibly narrow conception of corruption. Mm-hmm. As we think of corruption today, corruption is basically rule-breaking. It's quid pro quo. It's what criminals do, what bad people do. It's what third-worlders do. That's what corruption is. So you can know if you're not a third-worlder, if you're not a criminal, if you're not a quid pro quo type, if you're not a rule-breaker, then you're not engaged in corruption. That's basically the view that dominates in the political space. It dominates in jurisprudence, and it dominates in so much of popular and professional culture. And these two books come at that conception in two very different ways. Zephyr's book historically gives us an incredible entry into understanding the conception of corruption at the framing, at a time when America conceived of itself as defining a vision of a republic in contrast to a corrupted system which they knew and in some ways loved but believed had collapsed totally. And Janine's account is an account of a contemporary conception of corruption in many, many different spheres, from think tanks to media to government to the academy, very close to the work that I'm working on at Safra Center at Harvard, where we're focused on what we call institutional corruption, but there's no significant difference between these two. Now, what's striking about these two books is in one sense they're very, very different. They're talking about the same thing, but very different. Zephyr's book is incredibly optimistic in a certain sense. I was struck watching her run for governor that there was the feature of Zephyr that was most powerful was her smile, right? So in this book, there is a certain kind of smile because the problem which she's identified in this book is tied to a mistake which makes you feel like the problem is solvable if we could just get 1 or 2 people on the Supreme Court to change. Whereas Janine's problem is, her book, is incredibly depressing, right? Because at the end, it's hard to see what exactly you would do to address this problem. There was one moment at the end of the book, it's a really extraordinary moment, when she describes an event, incident at a TSA security check, where she didn't want to be body scanned, so she had to do special screening, and of course, to punish her, they made her wait and wait and wait and wait before they would find a special screener. And she described herself as focused and very disciplined and being as positive and upbeat and polite and kind as she possibly could be. But each 5 minutes she would ask, and they would say, well, somebody's coming, nobody came. And so she was at the last moment before she was going to be able to catch her flight. And she adopted a strategy to break this norm, which was she started singing as loudly as she could the Star-Spangled Banner. And of course, the TSA people quickly looked through their list of regulations, and it turns out it's not against the rules to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. So they had no reason to tackle her or to arrest her. And so the only thing they could do is to get her out by finding somebody to finally search her and let her go. So that's it. And I want to talk about what that tells us about this. But the general point, the general problem, the general depression of this is if we're in this problem in so many spaces, so many spheres, like what is the lever that we can use? So the way I'd like to proceed with this, is most of this conversation I want to have is the conversation between these two great authors of these two really great books. And then we'll have time at the end for questions from the audience. But I want to start with Zephyr and allow Zephyr to really introduce this idea, which modern jurists have erased from our history, this idea of corruption at the center of what the framers were talking about, and just help us understand how did they get it? Because in a certain sense, as I read Janine's book, I imagine that there would have been an equivalent of her book that could have been written in Britain that would have described the horrible state of the corruption in Britain, but then someone saw that and then figured out how to flip it when they came to America. So so just introduce this book.
Yeah, no, the book is really my far less exciting, but effort to stand in the middle of the street and sing the Star-Spangled Banner as loud as possible.
Yes.
So it's a deeply patriotic book. Recognizing, it was something I have really learned from Larry, is I've actually started almost quoting you verbatim, Larry, which is the founders of our republic, the men who wrote our Constitution, got many, many, many things wrong. They got race wrong, they got gender wrong, but they had some really powerful insights, and part of, I think, the impulse of the book is to say that if we are going to solve some contemporary problems, there's an extraordinary value in identifying the strains within our history in which there's extraordinary wisdom and value, and then elevating those, because it's going to take something like singing the Star-Spangled Banner, something more than just sort of going along and being cynical, to break out of our current crisis of corruption. At the Constitutional Convention, as I detail in the book, there are many different topics, but the topic that comes out more than any other is the question of basically corruption, what you might call now money in politics, but different ways in which money and power could lead public servants to represent themselves, their friends, a small group, instead of represent the public or their constituencies. And I came across this because I was starting to try to understand what the Supreme Court was doing in like how it was defining corruption in some cases in 2006, 2007. And so I said, well, let's see what they thought about it, back at the beginning. It's actually quite shocking once you read the transcript of the convention, how much this was the focus, the topic. When the New Yorker, Alexander Hamilton, later described the Constitutional Convention, he said, we tried to enact every practicable obstacle against corruption, cabal, and intrigue. And that seems like a pretty accurate description. They were sort of in there messing around. How do we put up barriers? How do we put up walls? Just a few examples, and then I'll answer your question more fully. One of the things that's most striking to me is they had their own version of what we now think of as the revolving door problem, where over 50% of people go into Congress now end up becoming lobbyists. Huge change from 30 years ago. And then also staffers come in and out. Staffers, and as Janine described so eloquently, it's more than staffers. It's sort of a whole network. Revolve in and out of private and public roles in many ways. Well, at the time, the revolving door problem of the Constitutional Convention era, or the threat, was people who would go into office to go into elected office in order to get an appointed office. Get a great job at the post office. Get a great sinecure that you might not have too many obligations. And so it was a way in which the king in England had really secured a lot of power to himself, because you basically take a parliamentarian, and if you could promise a really well-paid job, the parliamentarian would work for the king instead of working for the people in their constituency. And actually, Mason, who your school is named after, described the provision in our Constitution that prohibits holding an office while holding elected office as the cornerstone of the Constitution, the most important, because you didn't want people going into office and serving other masters. Where they got it from, there's sort of a blend of Christian and Aristotelian thinking in the founders thinking about corruption. But I would argue that the Aristotelian thinking predominates. It's just that the Lockeans at the convention also had something to hang their hat on. But really, Montesquieu, who was seen as the arbiter and the great thinker, and Montesquieu puts virtue and corruption at the core of a successful republic, and talks about, in language which is very reminiscent of Janine's book, if the public, for Montesquieu, it wasn't just the corruption of those in office, but the corruption of all citizens. Citizenship is an office that can be corrupted. You have an obligation as a citizen to be public-oriented in your public actions, not in all actions. And Montesquieu talks about, we're going to be in real trouble when the citizens of a country sort of give up and wait patiently for their hire. Basically wait patiently for the moment where they will be hired by one of these private entities. So that's sort of the route that I see coming into the convention.
But then when the framers were thinking about, for example, the corruption of Parliament,
right?
That kind of corruption operated differently from thinking about, or the thing that they were worried about was different from worrying about the way in which an individual might go into Parliament so that he could get a particular appointment, right? It was the king having an improper role inside of Parliament.
Yes, so I think those are related. So the king having an improper role inside of Parliament. There's also concern about, what Franklin talked about is people look at if you put the love of money and the love of power in the same place, it will excite the passion for the love of money and the love of power in such a great way that they will be confused, and the worst kind of people will go into public office because only those who want to have a lot of money and a lot of power, as opposed to those who want to serve more publicly. And we should figure out systems that will attract people who want to have a public orientation. But maybe I'm missing a part of your question.
Yeah, it's surprising because it's kind of the place we agree on most.
Okay.
So
dependency.
Because you're focused, right? Because you're focused still on this individual, but the important thing is that Janine's book brings out so powerfully is the institutional structure and incentive. So that was the sense in which they talked about.
Oh, absolutely.
Or you taught me that they talked about the Parliament, right? So teach us again.
Right. I mean, what they talked about is sort of the way in which, there's this lovely sort of history, as you know, the language of freedom and independence are very powerful words in American history. And I focus very much on sort of what's happening in this country. And independence at the time was seen as a kind of opposite to corruption, and independence as an opposite of dependence. And dependence and corruption is very similar. And actually you can see in the thinkers that the founders relied upon, they'll use dependence and corruption sometimes interchangeably, because the problem was that you would have institutions and individuals within those institutions who were dependent, had inappropriate dependencies outside, and were not independent of private power, independent of private money, independent of the king. And so they certainly thought about corruption in structural and institutional ways. I mean, it was sort of fundamental. Is you need to build a system which didn't encourage the wrong kind of dependencies.
Because that's the distinctive blindness of this court, right? This court will only think of corruption in individual ways, refuses to think about it in structural ways. And one of the puzzles is why they've done that. And this is a difference, and then I want to come to think about the relation to your book. But this is a really interesting difference in the accounts that the two of you give, because your book is very much a letter to a Supreme Court justice, or maybe two Supreme Court justices. And part of that letter, as I've tried to emphasize it, is to the originalists on the Supreme Court, people who otherwise say that we're going to interpret the Constitution the way the framers would have interpreted. Zephyr's book is a way of saying, here's what the framers would have understood corruption to mean, and it's radically inconsistent with the narrow conception of corruption that you're offering right now. That's one part of this message to the framers. But another part of the story you're telling is the way in which there's a long tradition of protecting institutions like governments against these corrupt, that all of a sudden disappears. And the question is, what's motivating it? Like, what are leading the justices to do that? Because the motivation for that type of corruption feels to me different from the account that you're giving about the motivation, to see corruption as just quid pro quo. I mean, that has an obvious return to the people who are advancing that idea, but do you think the justices on the Supreme Court are adopting this view because they think this is going to get them
I think it is one
rich?
of the great puzzles. I genuinely do. And the book has some provisional ideas, like why we see 200 years of a broad view that one of the jobs of courts in general is to protect against all these kinds of corruption. And then we see the collapse of that understanding. So why? Like, what is Justice Roberts really thinking? What is Justice Scalia really thinking? What is Justice Kennedy really thinking? How can they genuinely adopt this? And I propose a bunch of theories, and I have no idea if any of them are right. And it's a genuinely sort of provisional chapter where I'm throwing out a bunch of ideas because I want us to engage in this question. One theory is that they are sort of part of a network of what we call law and economics, a way of thinking about the world. And that way of thinking about the world relies on the vision of the selfish person, the egotist. And actually I tie that back to Hobbes, that it's a little bit of sort of Hobbes arises. And the founders were very anti-Hobbesian. Hobbesian sort of has a basically egotist view of the person, that the people are fundamentally selfish, that's it. You want to leverage their self-interest for as good things as possible, but when they wake up in the morning, when they go to sleep, when they're thinking about policy, they're thinking about themselves in one way or another. So it's that law and economics embeds that in its own model of the personality. Another, which is also related to law and economics, is just a belief that the best way to govern is outside of democratic representational government. Like that a market, I find this so fantastical that I have a hard time even expressing it, but that a market is a better distributor of public goods than a kind of collective public coming together in representative ways. So as much as we can remove politics from the distribution of goods, the better it is. And that vision is politics, and democratic politics is itself corrupt and corrupting. And so we should run away from that as fast as possible. Another sort of argument I put out there, a little more not controversial, but I know a lot of people who disagree with me on this one, is that we have a current Supreme Court that doesn't have any people with any political experience on it. So they do not know of what they speak. They have a fantasy about the way politics works, and they have no idea what it is like to sit in a room, be making strategy, and think how important that $2,000 or $4,000 or $6,000 is from a donor. And so they don't realize how profoundly corrupting the private system of campaign finance is. And so there's a kind of naivete or innocence to what they bring.
So they have all these mistakes or reasons that are tied to some kind of mistake, but it's hard to see them as doing it for their own personal self-interest, which is different from the kind of account that you're offering in many contexts, where it certainly serves the interest of people who will go from government to private interest, to conceive of corruption in this very narrow way, to celebrate the anti-corruption campaigns which are fighting corruption conceived in this narrow way, because it makes it easy for them to then have enormous personal gain. So I think you see it as tied to that motive much more. Is that?
Well, I talk about structured unaccountability and how accountability gets structured into corporate and government organizations, and then about the players and the way in which they very often don't even seem to be aware of the terrain on which they're playing. Of course, my background and my approach is as a social anthropologist, and as someone who worked in Eastern Europe under communism and then after communism. And I studied the difference between how the system said it worked, how it was supposed to work, and how it actually works, and or doesn't work. So, one thing that I charted was what's called dirty togetherness, what Poles called dirty togetherness. It was basically working under the table, doing deals, and in that context, it was people needed to do it in order, under communism, in order to get that cut of meat or gasoline or passport to travel abroad. You needed to have networks, and you needed to have these long-term sort of informal deals with people. And then after the wall fell, and I was still there working and trying to understand what would transpire, what I noticed was what has been called greed corruption, as opposed to need corruption, which is more this one-on-one corruption that takes place in a single venue that the economists like to chart, as opposed to people who are working in a systemically and across institutions. So what I saw was the government, a one-time government official who also was working for a Western bank, who also had his own foundation, connecting the dots and overlapping, having multiple and overlapping roles, and using the information in one venue for use in another. And fast forward a number of years to the West, and I began to see very similar dynamics, including the divergence between what the system purports to be and what people on the ground, what we realize is actually happening. So for instance, it used to be that retired generals, when they retired 20 years ago, I have a database that shows that predominantly retired generals and admirals would actually retire, play golf with their kids, or play with their kids. And now today, predominantly, that is most, continue to serve in a variety of ways in the defense industry. So for instance, a retired general will sit on a government advisory board that affords him access to proprietary information, while at the same time serving as a consultant to a defense company, or even setting up a venture capital, or being part of a venture capital company, at the same time that he's at a think tank, at the same time that he's maybe has a philanthropic activity as well. So this is what I call representational juggling. And the problem is that we, the public, it's an information problem. Yeah. We, the public, don't know what role or what agenda is being played out in any given context. So when that general, it's a problem, as Zephyr said, of serving multiple masters, and that goes back to the Bible, which noted that could be a problem way back then. It's, you know. So then when we're seeing a retired general on television, we have no way of knowing whether whether there's some agenda other than his actual expertise that's being presented, or whether there's some other agenda. And this problem is systemic. Unfortunately, we see it across the board in so many different arenas. Economists, academic economists. For instance, there was a study that came out a few years ago, UMass study that showed that charted the activities of 19 economists, academic economists, who were testifying before public bodies, including congressional subcommittees and so on, in the run-up to the financial crisis and after. They always tout and are identified by their most prestigious affiliation. So it would be, and their most neutral affiliation. So it would be think tanker or university professor, rather than that working as a consultant for a company or an industry. And so again, there's an information problem. The agenda is obscured. And the reason that I think that I've been kind of primed to see it going on is because of all those years in Eastern Europe in the 80s and after communism, because so much of what went on there was under the radar. It was hidden. In order to get things done, you couldn't operate the way the system said you should operate. It was impossible. So you had to have networks. You had to use your contacts. Even if you were an official working in a state organization, the only way you got things done was informally. And that's why there were so many of these guys who were managers were drinking all the time, because you had to drink with people in order to make deals. So it's an institutional, systemic problem. And we're seeing that sort of thing. We're seeing the informalization of influence right here in the United States. It's not just with Uber and Airbnb and these solutions people are turning to under financial stress. It's a much more kind of endemic problem. And we would think that traditionally, the media, one would think, would be there to help us sort this out. And this is clearly investigative journalists really should be helping us connect the dots of the networks and helping us to look into people's roles and so on. But the problem is that we know that the investigative journalism has been so gutted in the past years, and so splintered. And despite this vast information universe we live in, another parallel that I see with Eastern Europe, and some other scholars have noted it as well, is that there's been this routinization of media messaging, and Jon Stewart actually shows this very well. So you know how he'll switch from one channel to another channel to another channel, and people on different channels are saying the same thing. They're getting across the same message, even using the same words and the same lines. This is exactly what we saw. Or there are striking parallels to this under late communism. This routinization, this formulaic media messaging, and so how do we respond to that? We the public, we the citizens. Well, we do something that people under communism also did. We turn to parody. We turn to parody. So hence the popularity of Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, and the sense that their presentations can convey information and truths that can't be quite stated in the media. So I think
I want to get back to thinking about how this might be remedied. And
okay.
And the general's example is a very good one, because I mean, you describe how in one context it's 80%, in another context it's 90% of these former generals are now engaged in these consulting relationships or relationships where they're making, they're trading on their former expertise. And that's a contrast, a radical contrast to where it was before when nobody did it.
Or few.
Or very, very few would do it.
Fewer, yeah.
And this is similar at the Harvard Medical School. If you talk to professors who are in their 70s or 80s, they'll say in the 60s and 70s, nobody at the Harvard Medical School would ever have taken any money from a drug company. But today, if you don't take money from a drug company, it signals that you're not very good, right? Because so everybody feels like they do and they must, and that was the same dynamic you described with the generals, because the generals look around and this is what everybody's doing, and so why wouldn't I do it as well? But the striking part of the story you told about the generals that distinguished it from the economists is that you described when you were talking about the mentor generals, there was a rule that required them to disclose their conflict. And almost overnight, all of them stopped the relationship because it was too embarrassing. It was, in some sense, the shame of, they didn't want to be in a position of defending themselves, or the shame of it was too great. And so for them, given their past, the norms and the behaviors that they had developed, that was a pretty effective remedy to force that disclosure, made it go away. The economists, on the other hand, you describe, it's like they don't care. It doesn't even matter. It's almost a mark of virtue to demonstrate this kind of conflict. So this might point to places where we could think about something like transparency as being a remedy, and places where it's not going to be a remedy.
Right, right. Well, that's a very, I'd actually never thought of it that way, and that's a very interesting, it's very important, I think, to reflect on in what situations can people be named and shamed. Right. Because very often they can be named, but the shaming doesn't stick. Instead, it seems like if you belong to certain elite networks, you do what I call fail up. You continue even to get promoted, even though by all your performance on the job would indicate that you shouldn't be. But one thing I've been wondering about and would be really interested to get feedback on is the whole issue of bringing in outsiders and the role that they can play. And we just had a case recently, the New York Fed case with Carmen Zagara, where she was brought in to play, I mean, institutionally, to play this role of the outsider. And then, of course, she was wired and she ended up exposing what she felt was a too cozy relationship between the Fed and the banks, and she was then, of course, fired. But in a sense, this is what institutions and organizations and circles of people need to be encouraged to do. So the physicians who are, say, key opinion leaders, who are perked or paid by pharmaceutical companies to influence the opinion of our physicians. So we go to a physician and we may not know, our physician may not know that he or she has been influenced by one of these key opinion leaders, who they're always very high status people who sit on the boards of medical journals, are there professors in medical schools, and so on. But think about what about discussions within circles that also involve outsiders, because the challenge here is how to get outsiders in, and how to encourage the generals or the relevant medical community to understand that, hey, they really have to pay attention to how people think about them. I mean, how does revolution happen? I mean,
maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
I mean, that's kind of the experience that you and Tim had, right? You were outsiders in that political process, and you were defined as outsiders not because you weren't experienced or qualified or would have been great representatives of the state, but because you had no money, right? So you could be treated as second-class candidates because you had no money. You were not they wouldn't debate with you. And why wouldn't they debate with you? Because why would they debate with you? You couldn't possibly win because you had no money. So this feature of the structure of the system, that money is so central, makes it possible to exclude these outs. And so everybody on the inside then is complicit in exactly the game that you're describing, complicit in this trade of... Now, your experience, though, I mean, what was striking about your campaign was that you seemed to find a way to get people to react to that. Because, of course, the view is that people get it, but they don't care about it. But see, there's a smile. But is that true? Is that really what you, I mean, describe what that was like to get people to understand this and react?
You know, if I had the secret sauce, I'd be giving it away. But I will say, you know, there's so many, I think we were able to get through in part because there's such a sense in the media of a deadness in political language. It sometimes feels like the anti-poetry of modern politics. Like people just don't, it's not that you have to be a poet to be in politics, but people speak so many steps away from how they would honestly speak that it feels like even when they're telling the truth, they're lying. And so to be able to have enough freedom, which we did have in part because we didn't have big donors that we had to please. No, we had freedom for other reasons, but that freedom I think is very attractive right now, and it sort of relates to the freedom people feel when they see outside news sources too, and just a different way of talking. So some of it is actually just in the structure of thought and talking itself. I think you know, sometimes too much is made of the fact that people aren't coming out to vote because they aren't hearing the right message. I often think that that still focuses on like the magical serum of the message formula that will bring people out to vote. And I suspect that people are more likely to come out to vote if they feel something more akin to leadership or truth-telling. And in fact, one of the pathologies of our current system is that it trains you to not be a leader. It trains you to be a beggar. And that is true not just in running for office, because your job in running for office, as Larry has sort of led the way and insisting over and over that we understand how powerful this is, really powerful. 30 to 70% of the time Congress members spend raising money. So it trains you. I mean, just forget the number. Think about what that means. Like think about what your job is. So that it trains you to not be a leader. It trains you to not necessarily be a truth teller, but to be the deliverer of messages that resonate with those people who can give that kind of money. But that's true in other areas too. Like law school deans and nonprofit heads all have this same job. And so we ask something sort of weird of the public, which is come out to vote for people who do not seem like they are leaders, because they're trained in following, not trained in leading. I think that was part of it, is that we felt some freedom there. I do think that there is a, you know, I talk about it as a sleeping giant. Like there are people, and it's, the reason I think it's so important to engage now is it is so weird and rare in world history to have self-government. Like we should not take that for granted at all, or even see the threats to self-government as like odd little incursions that are easily fixed. It is very easy to have an oligarchy. It is very rare to have a democracy. And yet we still have some of that shame, you know, the sort of vestiges of that kind of shame. We still have a deeply civic sort of history and culture. So if we can tap into it now and rouse the sleeping giant before people lose their technical legal rights, it's really important to fix the system.
But one thing that was striking in contrasting the problem as you're confronting and describing it, and the way you've described it, is that, you know, obviously you and I have been engaged in a common project.
Yes.
And it's relatively easy in this sense, because when you call out the enemy, they're kind of nameless, faceless. Like we can say it's a terrible system to have such a tiny number of people funding elections. It's a corrupting system, but you can say it without feeling like you're hurting anybody you know well, right? Because even they would say, like even some of our friends who are big donors would say, this is a terrible system. I hate this system. We got to change the system. But what's striking about the story you're telling is that the enemy is within. They are our friends.
Yes.
Like there's no like good party and bad party.
Right.
Both parties are just as bad. And when you go through the people you name, at certain points I cringe because I know those people. And I'm like, oh, it's really hard. And that was the really tight connection, it felt to me, to the communist story, because you can imagine at the late part of the communist periods, people who even understood how the thing had to change, it was so hard to act because you were acting against your neighbor, against your friend in some sense. This is who they are. But when you talk about rally, when you sort of suggest at the end we rally this movement against these people, I wonder who's going to stand up and attack them, because we're not talking about attacking the other party. We're talking about attacking our party. We're talking about attacking the most successful, prominent people in our party. Like who has that courage?
Well,
I mean, you
no,
do. But
I mean,
who
no,
else?
no. But I mean, no. I think that's the bottom line question. What we've done is, and what seems to be happening not just in our country, but on a much broader scale, is created a system of increasingly of outsiders, where there are just a few insiders, and more we're living in a world where people are outsiders. And you see that in public opinion polls across the board, not just in this country, that people no longer have faith, have trust in public or informal institutions, whether it's courts or parliaments or churches or media. So it's a real issue that we're living with, and then the response to that is to go informal and to find these informal solutions. But I think the only way to begin to rebuild public trust is through this sort of leadership and leaders standing up and cross. I think elites have to begin to understand that these activities are not going to serve them in a long term way. And there are things that we can do in the meantime, and one of them is to really focus on how we. It might sound far-fetched, but the whole system of accountability is this checklist accountability that is everywhere. It's in education, it's in finance, it's in the anti-corruption industry, and the problem is that one simple number is supposed to convey the complexity or the health of an entire company or school. Or a country, that whether a country is, how corrupt a country is. And this has become so endemic in everything we do. And this is seen in practically every system, and it's seen as accountability. And yet it has the same problem we were just talking about. It's accountability from the outside through checklists and measures without ethics. Without this sort of moral community.
But can I just jump in just for a second?
Yeah.
So Tim and I named names, and I think that's absolutely essential, and are continuing to name names. And that when I look back at the populist era, and I think the populist era is really important because we were in a terrible place in 1900, just absolutely concentrated power, incredible networks. Of informal networks in very similar ways, and the journalists really led the fight. I mean, politicians were important, but journalists led the fight in a lot of ways, and those journalists were naming names. It wasn't corrupt system, it was this particular person. So last week I named a name, Dan Loeb. As far as I can tell, he's done nothing illegal.
Right.
but is spending millions of dollars of his own money to take over education policy in New York. But I think and he and I have a lot of mutual friends.
Yeah,
And so this is real, and I think it's a way to engage the fight and also a way to build trust, because if you're not naming names, it feels like there's a fantasy where you can sort of redistribute power without anybody getting hurt.
So we can hope that politicians will name names and behave like you and win. That's what we can hope for, right? But what I'm talking about in the context that you're describing is, imagine in the academy, your colleagues at the law school, and some of them are out there engaging in the kind of behavior that you're characterizing as corrupt behavior, right? Not because they personally are corrupt, but because they're selling their opinion to the highest bidder, or if you're in an economics department, or if you're a doctor among these, the point is these are your colleagues, right? And to imagine the strength that it takes to stand up and name names in that context is an extraordinary amount of strength. And so when I'm asking what is the mechanism that gets us out of this, talking about, let's assume we have an ethics beyond a checklist, feels a little bit like The Economist assuming the solution, which is the hard thing that we've got to build. So how do you get it there? What do we do that shakes us into that place?
I've concentrated on trying to, it takes all my time to try to figure out, given how fast things are changing, to try to understand these relationships, and that what we see in finance, we also see in media, we also see in education, and that these are systemic problems. And I've focused, it's crucial to follow the money, and you both have done just spectacular jobs of exposing the problems. There, I've concentrated on and think it's important for us to follow the players, because as Zephyr has put it so well, it's not a simple quid pro quo. Very often these players are engaged in long-term relationships, and it's not simple deal making, and it's often brand making. So Michael Chertoff, Michael Chertoff, who has his former Homeland Security chief, has his own firm, is always on TV as a terrorism expert. Now the Islamic State. This is part of brand building. He's not, I would assume, getting paid by the media for those op-ed, and so I think the first thing is, I know we have to come up with solutions, and that's the most important thing here. But the first thing I think is to really get a much better handle on the systemic nature of the problem, and the subtleties, and how under the table, under the radar, this is corruption, legal corruption, that's much less visible, much harder to detect, more elusive than the corruption we've seen in the past. It's not the simple bribe. It's not just need-based corruption. So the first thing I think is to do what you all are doing, is to try to get a discussion going, and in different circles. I think this cross-fertilization of circles and getting outsiders and inside. What would the postman or the store clerk say about this activity?
But what's striking then is you feel like you do have a solution, at least in the domain that you're within. That's what's kind of optimistic.
I got two.
Yeah.
We got to stick together.
Well, the first is, this doesn't solve everything, but for elected officials, their private funding of campaigns has failed. We have to have public financing of elections. And because the current system makes it close to impossible to get elected without being dependent on private interests. Yeah. So that's a failed system. It isn't doing what it's supposed to do. So that is a plausible, immediate change that can have real impacts on. You're still going to find some brand builders, but at least there's the freedom to be an elected official and not be working for a handful of big interests. And the other is, break up all the big companies. Don't laugh. And I think that's
I want
essential.
you to focus on the possible one, the possible of your two
It's
solutions.
absolutely possible. It's actually, you know, what's so funny
one.
is that, of course, I think of these two as tied together in a very deep way. But what's funny is that one has a more obvious emotional connection. When you talk about breaking up Comcast, Time Warner, it's not hard for me to get people on the, I mean, I'm not doing it tonight, but get you standing up and cheering about that. Public financing of elections is harder. But the connection is that one looks at, once institutions and wealth is accumulated, how can it be used to influence power? And the other is, what kind of institutions are sort of, do we want to have exist? What are the institutions of our economy? And I often think the sort of original sin of political science is the separation with economics, and of economics is the separation with political science.
Absolutely.
So that if we try to study either of these in splendid isolation from each other, we actually have a false portrait of power as it exists. And what that means is building an economic system with greater distribution. So it's actually harder to be, you know, even if you're church off, it's harder to be the servant of a few small interests because the number of bases that you're serving is greater. So change the way we fund campaigns and break up the big companies.
Right, but they're united, and they're both about decentralizing power.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And,
yeah.
and what's interesting about that way of framing it is it's actually potentially cross-partisan. Because, I mean, for example, even in economists like Luigi Zingales, who's a libertarian economist from the University of Chicago, writes about political antitrust. And his point is that antitrust law can't just think about the efficiency of markets. It's also got to worry about whether there are actors who are so powerful that they can bend the government to protect players in the market. So this is the reunion of these two branches that are essential to deal with this problem. But his solution is the same: decentralize this power. Okay, I want to decentralize the conversation. So right back here in the...
Yes, this is for Zephyr Teachout. I haven't read your book yet, but I was wondering, when you did your research on the Founding Fathers, whether you saw in them any strain that democracy is inherently corrupt, and that the answer to corruption is not more democracy, but less democracy. And it certainly seems like that, at least in the way the system was set up, was certainly, at least initially in my mind, what they had in mind. In other words, set up a system that really isn't democratic, and that was really the great fear that they had, that you have that the two go hand in hand. And I was just wondering whether you detected any of that in your historical research.
Yeah, there's no unity of the people at the, so let's just talk about the Constitutional Convention itself as sort of the folks who are writing the Constitution. And there isn't a unity in the solution to the puzzle of public servants serving private ends, and how to build truly less corrupt systems. There's a unity in the focus on corruption. So actually, the sort of core argument of the book is that we can, again, because it really starts as a letter to the court to say you've got corruption all wrong. We can disagree about particular solutions, but you have to understand that the Constitution is an anti-corruption document, and by anti-corruption we mean a document that is dedicated not to causing need-based, or not to stop a few bribes here and there, but to actually build a system that has the best protections against public servants becoming servants of private ends. Some of the folks at the convention had that focus. That is not the dominant focus, and there are certainly those who push back. There's this active debate within the convention between those who see elites as more likely to be corrupt, and those who see the exact opposite, those who see elites as less likely to be corrupt, and those who see the opposite. So there's this double debate, and then different institutions which are created. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives reflecting these sort of different impulses. And actually, the Madisonian approach is, well, the Senate will protect against some kinds of demagoguery, and the House of Representatives will protect against the corrupting nature of small elite institutions, because they certainly talked about the corrupting nature of small institutions.
Right here. Yes, you, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for a very stimulating and informative debate. Throughout history, discussion, conversation, But throughout history, people have always pursued interests, they've always manipulated, they've always looked for a better deal, and they've always called it, that's the way we do business. And what I think we've got is a very interesting dichotomy. From, as I understand from Zephyr's perspective, and looking at parts of the book, one way around it was some better court decisions, better institutions. Some of the decisions that were made along the way were pretty grim, and as a result, this is what we've got. What Janine's saying, essentially, is we don't know how we're in this situation because everything's so informal, and not knowing, we have to have very unorthodox sorts of approaches, like singing the Star Spangled Banner. So something that's way outside the rules, way outside the rules. And the question essentially is, if we're trying to rejig and reorient, where's our point of intervention? See, so often we talk about the nation state as the point of intervention. America is corrupt or not corrupt. We know that Zimbabwe is probably more corrupt than Denmark, but that's not very helpful. You know, what are the interventions? What are the institutions? What are the points of intervention? Are there points of intervention that might be appropriate?
Well, I think we've described some of them already. I mean, one of the singing the Star Spangled, the reason I talked about that, and I feel like I should sing it now, but I won't.
I think you should.
No, that's at the end. You're supposed to do
At
that,
the end, okay. Is because, and it was just a little example of this sort of this parody strategy that was used by the yes men. And has been, there are different groups like that have used basically a lie. I mean, what they did in one case was they put out in the media that the company that was responsible for the Bhopal disaster in India in the 80s, that company was suddenly going to pay reparations to all those people who, whose lives were ruined or seriously upended by it. And of course that wasn't true, but it forced the company to respond to that. So so there's that very sort of crazy thing, but that's obviously ad hoc and piecemeal. It's not systemic. We've talked about regulation. Of course, one of the things we need to do is understand that regulation doesn't end with the president's signature. The devil is in the details, and we've certainly seen that in the aftermath of Dodd-Frank, where provisions are being watered down and cut out and so on, and also that the passage of laws then often leads to or can lead to unintended consequences. I mean, we've seen that with regard to lobbyists. That in 2007 there were restrictions passed on lobbyists. More restrictions were put into place, and that may be why there's been such a growth in what I call shadow lobbyists. The number of registered lobbyists has actually declined by about 25% since 2007. So, I mean, I hate to say again, we need to inform ourselves, but we really need to have a much better grasp on and understand that the world around us has changed so quickly and so dramatically that that it's very hard to.
Yeah, one of the things your book does very well, Zephyr, your book does very well in telling the history of this is to describe the wide range of experimentation that legislatures engaged in and courts engaged in to try to address this problem. Understanding it had to evolve, the problem would be different, it had to, and the consequence of what the Supreme Court has done is to eliminate 90% of those possible interventions.
A bad decision.
Yeah, a series of bad decisions, which make it so that the only thing that they can address is this one tiny sliver of the problem. And so part of the remedy.
We want, far more experimentation. And
yeah.
what the court did is it says there's things you cannot do. You can pass anti-bribery laws and you can have public financing of elections. You can't limit corporate spending. You can't limit this kind of aggregate spending. So basically the range, and I think of, not to be glib about it, but I think of democracy as like a constant game of whack-a-mole. And there will not be a permanent solution. And we shall seek it lovingly. Because that each country and each moment in time, we should address the individual pathologies of that time as they exist and continue to respond to them, because I don't actually have an end of history view that we can achieve a completely stable world where those in power don't try to then again accumulate even more power.
Right. Tim.
Thanks. I guess I did the introduction, but I can ask questions too. So I've been going through this presentation becoming alternatively optimistic and then depressed. And it's sort of but one thing I think you all agree on is that remedies are one of the most interesting questions and hard questions that we're facing today, and that transparency is overrated. I think all of you agree as a remedy. I mean, you're saying it's an information problem, but I think so often the problem we see is, some investigative report does some great thing, reveals that, oh my God, this person's, in the New York State Senate, and unless it's criminal, it's like, well, that was an interesting little story, and then nothing happens. There's been so many articles about people who've done this and that, and public, unless it involved blocking a bridge, and even then, not that many people lost their job, or involves something explicitly criminal, so people end up in jail. It takes going to jail. So that remedy is. And one of the theories out there, I think even the founders' theories, is that nothing would ever really work unless you had the right kind of virtue in people. And is there any? It sounds so sort of naive, but hopeless. But is it possible somehow to try to institutionalize or encourage people who are just incorruptible themselves involved in politics, or is that just a kind of, do you think, a hopeless kind of way of doing this Roman idea of virtue as a starting point of trying to create a better politics or an anti-corruption mission?
I want to respond first to what you described first, because I actually think there are some things that can be done in that area. I feel like a lot of reporters sort of came up reporting on the West Wing, and now we're in Game of Thrones, and they're still reporting as if we're like in the West Wing with a few exceptions. So it changes the way you report. So instead of a single story about institutional corruption, that should be the ongoing story. So it's not Watergate reporting, it's Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens reporting. And they're just different kinds of reporting. And you are a great example of that kind of systemic machine politic reporting, instead of like acting as if we're still in West Wing land. And I think that helps. Right. I think for the moralism is key, but actually to your yes men point, I think art is key too. And sort of engaging people in the sort of artistic and poetic sensibility, so that we don't sort of put up running for office as something you do as a martyrdom, or if you're a really, really inspired scold, but as something in which there's some like joy and morality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize a bunch of the corruption you're talking about won't really be understandable as good versus bad. I mean, you think about the academic who is choosing to become an expert in a case that's forcing her to do things which she otherwise wouldn't do, but she's doing it because this is the best way she can get her kid into private school, and she thinks her kid has to get into private school. That person is motivated in some sense for the best possible reasons, taking care of their family. And unless, and the idea of saying to that person, you ought to be, virtuous, her response is, I am being virtuous. My virtue is too. So it's hard to just imagine that you will yourself out of this without thinking of structural changes that give the possibility, the hope of people to do the right thing.
Can I? I'll go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's why I think there needs to be, sort of a real discussion. I mean, if we're playing, we ourselves are playing, within the community, professional and otherwise, if we ourselves are playing overlapping roles, let's talk about it, because it is subtle. It often is very ambiguous, and we all, we know that we tend to respond most to what our peers do and take our cues from our peers, and so that's hence the structural problem. But I do think that again, that it isn't easily seen as good and bad. That's what makes it so problematic.
Sorry to go on, but one thing I notice also when I think about this problem, which I think is really kind of intractable, is that for a lot of the things you're talking about, the generals, the economists, politicians and revolving doors, is you notice an absence of hard choices anymore. In the sense that I can be an economist, be fully accredited, have this great title, but then also rake in a whole bunch of money at the same time. Oh, then also I can write for newspapers when I have an opinion on something. And there's never a point in which you have to choose. I want to be rich, I want to be prestigious. And it seems different in our era that you don't have to choose. I mean, it could be that if you the fact is if you do actually work for corporations, it's very hard then to place an op-ed because they're like, well, that's just the corporation writing.
Exactly.
Right? But
that's why you need the think tank
a lot of
or the university.
Positions have eliminated the hard choices.
This is where I think Larry and I disagree. I'm not sure, but I think shame it plays a very important role, and there's nobody whose hand I wouldn't shake, and there's nobody who I wouldn't have a full conversation with. But I think that there is a value in calling out and shaming individuals, because otherwise I think it's hard to create that sense of hard choices. So the solution can still be structural, but I think in the interim, creating a sense that that there is a cost to engaging in some of these non-illegal or legal corruption. I think there's a value in that.
I think I agree with both of you.
Well, then, by the principle of transitivity, we don't disagree. Okay. Any question about that?
Hi. I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I am Janine's publisher, but I think it is funny, though, that you guys have both brought in this concept of shame, and one of the closing chapters of Janine's book is talking about this naming and shaming game, and I think there's different ways to have this shaming. You could be, like you, Zephyr, you're kind of in a public position to call people out and say, like, hello, you've donated millions of dollars to fund your policy goals. But, Janine, could you maybe elaborate on how kind of we as individuals shame these people that we see doing things that are legal corruption but still maybe not ethical? This idea of kind of naming and shaming that we all seem to amorphously agree on.
Well, yeah, I think that's where we really need the investigative reporters, and it's become a lot more complicated because so much more of governing and policy these days is outside of formal government, and people do play overlapping roles, and the ethical problem comes in when the roles aren't disclosed, when somebody's testifying before a public committee and using the more neutral or prestigious affiliation of the think tank or university without disclosing the corporate role. So I think the reason I agree with both of you is because I think that what Zephyr is suggesting is a step to this naming and shaming is a step to addressing the more, can be a step to addressing the more structural, systemic corruption. The caveat to that potentially is that shaming doesn't always work. And again, that depends, as has been pointed out by Tim. And that, I think, has something to do with the nature of the network, and that I've tried to.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't work because, for example, you say the economists don't give a damn, they're just going to do it anyway. That's unfair to many economists, but that's the way that's characterized. They're proud of it. They're kind of proud of it. Right, but that's the more general point. Like, in our own field, if you went around to other academics who were doing consulting and said, that's outrageous, you are behaving unethically, what they would say is, why am I behaving unethically? And then you would say, you would invoke this big theory about why this creates the wrong influences inside. But the point is, it doesn't engage at the same place of shame that it might engage when you're talking about somebody who's taking a bribe or doing something that's already been understood to be wrong. So this is the challenge. You are defining the wrong, and we have to believe it before you can actually invoke the emotional power of correcting or criticizing somebody on the basis of that wrong.
Right, we don't
have that yet.
Yeah.
Yes, you had a question. You have a microphone, 1 second.
Okay, I'm curious as to what the venues are for these discussions, these open discussions and conversations, because I'm really sick and tired of things happening racially, in gun problems and school shootings and all the rest of it, where everybody on TV and everyone, we're all talking about having a conversation. Where are these conversations? What is the venue for them to have an effect? We're in this room with 6 people perhaps, and we're having a conversation. Where does it go? I mean, how do we get that across when the only way to get to any moment where you have a conversation is in the public domain, which seems to be controlled by money? Now, I heard you speak twice on radio, and once in Hudson.
Okay.
And the reason after that I went to bat big time was because not once did you mention money. You only talked about issues. And that was the most important thing to me, because every time my husband and I have donated to politicians, that's it. They call us and send 50, 100 emails every day, and it's all about money, and that's all. The issues have disappeared. It's all about money. So I don't see how you get around that, to have these conversations that we're going to have that are going to possibly change everything, which is a possibility. I'm tired of going to marches. I'm too old.
Well, thanks for your support. I don't know. I don't know except by doing. So in the last week, I've had about 6 of these conversations, most of them not televised. And that is sort of what I do as a way. And they're about different things. You know, one was about access. You know, I was actually about sort of institutional corruption and access to capital by Black entrepreneurs in New York State. One was about education policy. One was about you know, sort of questions of constitutional law. So I am sort of personally playing around with these moments, but you know, the great what is it? Passage to India? Only connect the passage and the prose, and both will be exalted. So my own personal strategy is to sort of persistent connection and hoping that something can happen there. So maybe you shouldn't stop going to marches.
That's nice.
I think we have time.
Sing at the airport.
Okay. First, as someone who is in an entirely different field, I'm glad to hear that art gets a shout out for having some voice in this. I'm a theater director, so yeah.
Great.
But I guess I wanted to ask, I think the remedy of making public funded campaigns would be great, but I think we're also talking about the cost of engaging in those things. And I wonder about the cost of citizens engaging or not engaging, because I think even though public funded campaigns would maybe get us a better selection of people to vote for, with like gerrymandering so rampant, I feel like it often feels like there is no cost to voting or not voting because it's going to be rigged. So even if you have a better person to vote for in each category, it feels like it often won't make a difference. Do you have some sort of, what is the remedy to the lower levels of corruption? We mentioned, citizenship as a role being corrupted. How do we sort of uncorrupt that as well?
Well, I am on a kick to get more people with artistic backgrounds to run for office. So we should talk. But I will tell you, one of the reasons that people do not one of the reasons, the reason creative, deeply political people are not running for office is because they do not want to raise money in the way that they currently have to raise money. It is the biggest barrier. It is the biggest barrier for women. Public finance is a key feminist issue. We know more women run for office in a public financing system. It's a person of color issue. We know more people of color run for office in a public financing system. And of course, along with all this, it is a class issue because we know people who do not have a pre-existing circle of friends who can finance their first $100,000 to $200,000 do not run for public office. And so I asked a young person the other day, are you not going to run for office because it's square or because it's corrupt? And she said, a little square, a little corrupt. So we got to make it less square and less corrupt. But if we had those people in office, it changes who runs and changes what they do, what their daily job is, how their job is to listen more broadly. Then you have a lot more meetings with the public and a lot fewer meetings with the super wealthy. That changes how many people engage in another way. And then that changes who is voting in Albany for a gerrymandered system. So I think they're all connected.
In the back here.
You take this.
So I'm very close. Okay. So I'm wondering, the New York Times had a really powerful story this weekend about how attorneys generals are banding together for Republicans, really horrifying. And then DFA has been sending me emails for 2 days about helping Elizabeth Warren because she's under attack. What is the risk in the current system that renegades like Elizabeth Warren are going to be knocked out? And what can we do to help preserve them and keep them in?
Your turn. Larry, do you want to take this one? I just feel like I've been answering the questions, too.
Well, Massachusetts will keep Elizabeth Warren in. There's no doubt about that, I think. But I think it's an important question because there are people who are powerful, great representatives in that slice who are not as powerful as Elizabeth Warren, who are easily swamped by the incredible amount of money that can be devoted against them. So I think the only answer is exactly the Zephyr answer. We've got to get to a place where it's not a tiny, tiny few who have this concentrated power in the first stage of an election, which is the money election, but instead it's all of us who have that power. I mean, this is the parallel that I think people miss, but I think is so compelling. You think about the protests in Hong Kong. Right? Those kids were presented with a system of, quote, democracy. The system was a committee of 1,200. We're going to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong could then vote for. And what the kids in Hong Kong said was, this is not democracy, this is crazy. 0.024% of Hong Kong will get to pick who we get to vote for? No. We should be able to pick who we get to vote for, right? We should be able to participate in the nominations as well as the elections. Well, of course, the system we have here is exactly that system. Because there's 2 elections. The first election is the Green primary. In the Green primary, a tiny, tiny number get to pick who the candidates are, the people who fund these elections. I've calculated it's about 150,000 Americans, same number of people as are named Lester in the United States, right? So we have the same tiny, tiny number who have this extraordinary power that they took to the streets for. Why can't we take to the streets for it, right? And I think part of that is just getting us to see how we've been denied this kind of democracy because of this concentration. And it's not just going to block the Elizabeth Warrens, it's going to block any sensible person who wants to be able to participate who doesn't have that Rolodex to pull from. Okay, I think we are coming to time. Let's take one more. Can we take one more question? To the back here.
Rats, I had 2, and the first one was going to be if corruption is the same as, dependence, yeah. If corruption was the same as dependence, does the fact that we have a very different setup of labor in the United States now, where very much fewer people work for themselves, how does that change things? But instead, I'm going to ask, what do you think of what do all 3 of you think of the approach of tackling corporate personhood as an issue? Is this effective, or is that sort of misguided in some way?
I used to think it was misguided because I don't think it's the key issue, it's certainly not what the court is turning on. The Supreme Court is not turning, the Citizens United decision is not dependent upon corporate personhood. Their logic is somewhat different. It goes to the idea of the right to hear, regardless of the creator of the speech. That said, I guess I've seen the energy around it, and I think that energy is worth following. And so the fact that it may not be the technical reason for Citizens United, but there is something about the way the court anthropomorphizes corporations, even if not directly, that's somewhat disturbing. And the extraordinary energy suggests that this is the way many, many Americans understand their own experience of being completely out of power. And so I think it's worth connecting on that. My own focus, of course, is on sort of concentrated wealth, not the corporate form itself. So that I sort of tend to then move towards antitrust and anti-monopoly, and then really celebrating, because I think it's worth celebrating, a vibrant small business marketplace. And I think that it can be the thing that's lost is the celebration of the decentralized economic marketplace.
I would just add to that in statement that the biggest problem, I think, or a huge problem for our country, our society, is the intertwining of corporate and state power, and to see corporations and government as separate is a real mistake. I mean, 3/4 of people who work for federal government are actually private contractors, and you see this blended government on all levels. So I just would speak to that point.
Yeah, and I appreciate you including me. That was nice. So I get to answer this too, because I feel strongly. I feel strongly about this. So I feel strongly. First, I agree with Zephyr. This is one of those things that rallies people, and that's exciting and powerful. And second, the corporate personhood issue is a problem in a bunch of areas of law. It's not so much a problem in the campaign finance area of law. For example, it's a problem if you want to force a corporation to label a product in a certain way. The Supreme Court has a series of stupid decisions which restrict the ability to have that kind of labeling requirement that's not directly tied to campaign finance, but is a problem that it would be great to solve too. But the thing that I worry about when we focus on